So for those of our guests who don't know Adam Nathaniel Furman, just a very brief introduction, Adam. You're an artist and designer of Japanese and Argentinian origin. You're based in London. You trained in architecture and fine arts, and you work in those areas, but also creating products, interiors, you write, you teach. So it's quite a portfolio that you realize.
Yeah.
And
it's
so
a kind of typical millennial where just had to do lots of different things.
Multitasking, yes. But you also run a research group on color in architecture and urbanism. And
I co-run with Anthony
you co-run
the artist.
at the AA. So I really wanted to have you as a guest in our talk, Adam, because I think your work is quite outstanding in the current world. It's such a splash of energy and joy, colors and patterns. So in a time where, interiors tend to be rather, pared down, and there's this consensus about minimalism, etc. I think it's a very sharp and interesting position that you take, and I would like to speak with you about that. And what is interesting is that you work on these different scales, from the single product over space up to the urban scale, which is also, I think, an important aspect, that you bridge those scales. And sometimes I think you even are deliberately confusing scales, an object that takes the shape of a building and vice versa. So when looking at this wide range that you cover, what would you say is there a kind of common denominator in that work that runs through all those different scales that you work at? Is it about space? Is it about patterns and color? What would you say?
Who are you? It's kind of like, I guess if I had to sort of boil it all down, there's a kind of real fundamental passion and kind of love when I'm working, which is to do with making things or spaces. I tend to think of spaces as collections of things. Actually, space is a concept I find very difficult to understand generally. And I think of objects, and I think of spaces, these collection of objects, as modes of non-linguistic sharing and communication. They are instinctive, emotional, atmospheric ways of sharing quite deep and profound things about us as individuals and us as groups with each other. And to give you an example, on an individual basis, somebody who's creating their own home without any sort of social influences or trying to signal who they are to other people necessarily, they're externalizing their individual identity, and that's a human. It's a kind of almost a biological necessity. It's kind of the first thing that the first traces that we have, along with tool making and this creation of and sustenance of fire, is the decoration of the caves around us. And then the very first thing that we did when we started to create enclosures that were not natural, right? We wove them, we created tents. And the first thing we started to do was to create patterns, ornamentation and decoration in the weaves of those inhabitations that we were creating. And they were always externalizing and representing, in a kind of non-linguistic way, values, meanings, stories, narratives, hierarchies of the individuals in the groups who are making them. And it's the same thing with our bodies, and fashion is a kind of similar thing, because, along with tools, right? People made tools, but actually they've realized now that these teardrop shape things that they thought were tools are actually, they're pretty sure that they're gifts, right? They're ornamental gifts. These, what they thought were axe heads that were being collected from thousands of years ago all over the Northern Hemisphere, were actually not functional. And it's similar with the body. So, we tattoo ourselves. It's one of the first things that humans have done, right? We also physically change ourselves in quite extreme ways. And so I guess what I really love is seeing the traces of myself. I'm quite an egoist, but also of others, and also of cultures, in things and spaces. So the reason I say I don't like space is I think that space is quite a masculine ideological construct of modernity to erase difference, right? It's a continuous universal thing which doesn't exist, right? The idea of just shadow and light and space, it kind of erases everything inside it, and it just makes the architect the master. So that's why for me, things, surfaces are what really contains all of the depth and the excitement and the beauty and the meaning and the stories and the narratives and the history of people, right, of us. And that's why I guess design really attracted me quite early on. I saw reflections of, I guess, my family experience and the way that, you know, very often within immigrant families, right, objects hold almost religious significance because they represent things that have been lost, but they also represent the creation of something new, a sort of safety bubble in your new environment through things. It's a very long-winded answer.
Well, but it gives a lot of different connecting points. And you were mentioning your different cultural backgrounds, Japan, Argentina, you have a Jewish background as well. Do you think this has informed this hybrid mix that you are, or maybe even sampling of different elements that you are practicing? Would you say that there are really elements of those backgrounds in your work, or would you say it's just new?
No, I'm not somebody. I'm not somebody who says I'm ex nihilo out of nowhere at all. I'm very much someone who thinks that I am very much a product of the things that I've lived through in my environment. I don't want to. I don't reduce everything that I am to the story of my family. It's just part of, you know, for all of us, it's part of a tapestry of our lives that feed into everything that we do in a very important part of my life. And so yes, I would say that the experience of being the child of a family from multiple cultures, which was situated not in any of those cultures, but in a new place, right? Which is actually can be a very positive thing, where they got to construct their own new existence, their new own identity and lifestyle, but also in a way being estranged from all of those cultures, right? So not actually being able to be a part of any of those, and also being to a degree estranged from the culture in which I was brought up, had a very positive effect, because being in a family that turned that into something that was creative, right? So, you know, constructing a safe, friendly, interesting, rich environment which related to all of those, but then also engaged productively with the context of the amazing city that, you know, they chose, that they ended up living in, was something that I guess gave me an appreciation, not an appreciation, I guess an inability to do anything apart from understand that there's a constant shifting and changing communication and sharing between all cultures. And that's something that is very positive. And so I see it as positive, but it's almost like that was just a natural thing that came out of my environment growing up, something naturally that I did, like it's a way of seeing the world. You know, there's no borders or divisions. There's a constant gradient of interesting conflicts, micro conflicts, disagreements, but also wonderful cross traditions, things moving around constantly. And here I'm talking about food, I'm talking about ornamentation, I'm talking about taste, color, fashion, traditions. You know, if we're talking about religion, right, even within the religious tradition of my family, of my parents, which is Judaism, right, there's so many different traditions there, depending on where you are in a country or which country you're in. And of course, even in that world, we were not from one, we were from multiple ones. So it's kind of cross human experience thing. So yeah, and that set me up very well for being a Londoner. Because, you know, can you get, there's very few cities in the world that I think in a way reflect that so well. Maybe I don't know, New York. I'm in London, so I don't really know very many other cities, so I'm just probably being presumptuous.
yeah. Well, I think when we discussed previously before this talk, I was referring to some, you know, typically Western modernist cliches of creating spaces, and you were very strict about saying that you completely reject this idea of the West and the rest in design, and I completely agree with you. And I think what you're just saying explains this, because it's more about this complexity and this multitude of different backgrounds, where the clear border between, you know, this cliche of superiority that the West has a long time had is seeming completely unimportant compared to the complexity that we're facing today, and that we're seeing in works like yours. Now let's look for a while at the interior space. At the moment in the museum, if we were open, we would have an exhibition in our spaces about interior design called Home Stories, where we try to describe some of the game-changing interiors, if that exists, of the last 100 years. And I wanted to speak with you also as an interior designer, even though you're not considering yourself as someone. You said you rather think about interiority and about space. Nevertheless, I think you make an interesting contribution to that practice. And very often this discipline of interior design is seen as rather, it's either gay or it's seen as a female discipline. It's sometimes not seen at the same level like architecture or product design. But yet it's such a super interesting practice because it shapes the spaces that we inhabit. How do you look at that practice? Would you see yourself as an outsider who works in interior design as an artist, or how do you think about interior design from your perspective?
Well, I'm always an outsider in everything that I do because I'm situated kind of floating around different professions. So I guess, sometimes I'm speaking to people in relation to product design, sometimes I'm speaking to people in relation to interior design, sometimes architecture, sometimes theory, sometimes that, so there's multiple hats. So I constantly feel like not only an outsider but an imposter. The imposter syndrome, which is partially why I don't want to call myself an interior designer. It's actually through respect for interior designers, right, for the profession. Mm-hmm. It's why I don't call myself an architect. It's because I understand that there's a lot of embedded professional experience, knowledge, and understanding that goes with being called that, right? And I wouldn't presume that just because I've done a couple of projects that I am that I have that project management, that conceptual experience and understanding in relation to all the complexities of the profession. Mm-hmm. However, I do love architecture, and I do absolutely love what we would call interior design. And I'm very, and this is a lot with students, right? I tend to find that they gravitate, a certain amount of students tend to gravitate towards creating environments. Okay. So thinking about it. And when I say interiority, it sounds like a kind of snobby word, but actually all I mean is a full environment that is all encompassing, right? That it's like a womb that you can go into where everything that you look at is human created and considered, rather than in a street, which is about a collection of different considered things with different parameters at different times. So it's a completely constructed environment. And that's an interiority. And a lot of students are drawn to that because that is the kind of environment that really affects you. That's the environment that we spend those environments are the ones that we spend all of our time in. Those are the ones that we die in. We're born in them. Those are the ones we sleep in. We have other stuff in them. we hang out in them. Like everything we do is in them. I mean, I adore facades and they're very, very important, but actually a disproportionate amount of academic discussion goes on about the shell of a building and actually not what goes on in it. It's a little bit like in music, right? 99% of songs are about love, but 99.9% of music criticism is about every song that's not about love. So because it's considered, sort of effeminate or silly or emotional. And it's very similar with interiors, right? They were not considered for a significant period of the 20th century, because this is different actually in the 18th and the 19th century, but for a very significant period in the 20th century, there was a hierarchy that was set up where the structure of the building, the exterior of the building, was serious, masculine, intellectual, structural, truthful, engineering. It had weight and sustenance, and it was in the city, and then everything that was decorated, everything that was interior, everything that was soft, everything that touched the skin, everything that had color was effeminate, superficial, unserious, unintellectual. And what happened was it got relegated, but it was taken up by a lot of fantastic designers who very often happen to be women or queer women or gay men. And there's this incredible history throughout the 20th century of the most wonderful interiors that, you know, were done for incredible clients, and they're actually very popular, right? They're actually very present, for instance, in a lot of popular publications throughout the 20th century, but were completely excluded from the academic canon, right? So from the academy, from discussion, from criticism, because they were given these qualities of being seen as, well, all of feminine. And this gendering has kind of remained quite a lot in a kind of uncriticized way into the way that we think about design now still, and the way that we talk about design. And unfortunately, my students have to come across that, and unintentionally, right? Because people don't mean to be like this, but in the way that their work is criticized by tutors in a well-meaning manner, pushes them away from this very, you know, approaches that might be seen as silly or superficial or faddish or colorful, unserious or just about fashion. And you know, they get pushed away from it, right? Yeah. Because they're told it's those things, which I find quite sad. But there's an absolutely incredible history. And I'm working on, I'm starting to work with Joshua Mardell on a book for the Royal Institute of British Architects, looking at queer spaces over the past 250 years throughout the world. It has quite a Eurocentric focus, but as much as possible throughout the world. And these were all almost exclusively interiors, right? And this goes for both queer people and also women and people of, you know, marginalized identities or different religious identities, because public space was not welcoming. It was unsafe just to be, let alone to express yourself through space, right? Like I was talking about before, with the fact that people always want to express themselves, not want to. It's a biological necessity of human nature to express yourself through your clothing, through marks on your skin, through the spaces around you, through decoration. And marginalized people, queer people, women couldn't do that, right? This public space was not for them. Could they design facades of buildings? Could they design no, they couldn't, because the public space was for a certain set group of people, right? Like the ones who could vote at the time. And so interiors became the space of expression of these identities, like the boudoir. The boudoir was specifically the space for the woman to be able to take care of her body and express herself and actually meet with other women and discuss things, and actually became quite a radical space. A lot of things happened there because it wasn't overseen. And salons in the 19th century and the early 20th century became spaces for queer people to meet and discuss, but also show things and express themselves. And so there's a kind of, in a way, that partially led to the modernist rejection of them as kind of women and queer. And in a way gave these people a space of expression. But at the same time now, there's a sort of fusing that interiority somehow is fixed onto those identities. And I'm kind of been pushing that actually I think public spaces now should be a little bit more open to everyone in terms of a very public exterior expression of all forms of identity.
Well, could you mention a few of those spaces that have been important for you as an inspiration, or as a point that you relate to regarding your own work?
In what way? You mean?
Well, in a formal way or in a conceptual way, that you know, these spaces convey different paradigms of creating a space, using a space, than spaces that have been canonized in the official Western modernist conception of space.
So okay, another aspect of this, which is endlessly sad, right? And another aspect of my sort of background, the my Jewish heritage, this is also something that's common with that, is the loss of these spaces, right? They don't exist anymore. So a sort of commensurate aspect of them being not celebrated, not lauded, and having to happen in private spaces, but that they also weren't protected, because they were either hidden or they were kind of actively disliked. So I think, you know, for instance, in terms of, you know, in very interesting interiors, like, you know, Whistler's Peacock Room is a highly unusual one that's been protected and kind of like moved to America. But it's very difficult to get photographic documentation, let alone drawn documentation of them. So on the one hand, there's like a lot of inspiration, like reading Jane Stevenson's book Baroque Between the Wars is like just deeply inspirational because there's a profound amount of research and sort of states incredible arguments for these alternative spaces. But it mentions so many examples that were lost. And the things that happen in them, the stories around them. And similarly, like I like to imagine, like, what was Natalie Clifford Bailey's salon like in Paris, in the 1920s?
Yeah.
I mean, all those amazing lesbians, getting together in that salon, and like, how did they decorate it through its different iterations? And then, but then there's obviously, is there a book here? I just got this book through the post. I splashed out on it. I was talking to you about this earlier. Dorothy Draper in the pink, absolute star, and like very well, kind of like wildly eccentric woman. Very successful, like interior designer to the stars. And the work is not very well known now. It's kind of, I think people, sort of like disco classicism, Hollywood classicism. And it's just astonishingly inventive, rich, joyous, clever, sophisticated, but in ways that, the canon cannot really accept. They can barely accept the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami because, it has a bit of decoration on it. Lord, God forbid.
In the Home Stories exhibition that we have now, we have one of the first examples is Cecil Beaton's house, for example.
Well, that whole set were, they were existing in interiors, right? That were, extremely flamboyant. And have you heard of this book Lot by Schöne von Reinhold?
No.
So it's just amazing. It's just come out. Well, no, actually, lockdown has messes with your sense of time. It came out about a year ago, but it's a book which very much is about the sort of the beautiful young things, right? That period, 20s, and it creates an alternative history that within those beautiful young things there was this queer black character, and it sort of mines this alternative history. But the book is exquisitely written, and as well as poking fun at the sort of the art world and the minimalism of the design world in Holland, which I always love doing, is exquisitely encrusted with really beautiful and over the top descriptions of not only those spaces, right, like spaces, but also the way that they existed in them, right? The ceremony, the way that they dressed, the way that they invented themselves in those spaces. And that's, so like with my students, not with my students, I mean, when I'm giving a lecture, like there's a lecture that I give, which is sort of related to my particular approach or relationship with queerness. And that's that, there's several scales, right? So you have the body, and then you have the closet, and you have the mirror. And very often for someone who doesn't feel comfortable in their body because the world tells them their body is disgusting and the way that they want other people's bodies is disgusting, it's very important to have a safe space where you can construct your new identity, right? You can change your body, right? You don't have to change your body, but you can change it through your clothes. So you have a mirror, and that specularity with clothes that allows you to change who you are into a way that makes you feel safe. It makes you feel that you can take on the world, right? It's extremely important. So like coming out the closet for me is like kind of the idea, not just like telling your parents you're gay, but it's the idea of constructing an identity because the world has taken the one away from you that you just have in your naked form. Then there's the room, and the room is the next step. It's where you start to take that work that you're doing and you expand it out into the room. You start to think, well, me and the world, how is this? What does the world look like if I'm actually involved in making it? Because probably at school you're being bullied, right? And you're hiding in the library, and you're definitely not participating in the spatial making through activity that happens in school. And then the next step, right, is to go out and be performative in the world. And there's these kind of very, very clear spatial stages which relate to interiority and the body.
That's super interesting, and it reminds me of an exhibition we made 3 years ago about the design, the interiors of nightclubs and of club culture, where we thought about similar issues, where these clubs are stages to construct identities that you probably would not be allowed to display in public space in a certain era. So these were really safe spaces where this was possible, and it was possible in a ritualized and performed way. and where this conception was supported not only by this designing of the space, but by lights, by music, by fashion. So all these aspects were part of those spatial designs.
Yeah, and we just, there's an installation which I've just had opening in the Triennial in the National Gallery Victoria in Melbourne. Is a collaboration with Sibling Architecture in Melbourne. And it was, the commission was to queer the 400 square meter entry space of the Triennial and the cafe. And the majority of actually the discussions was just us talking about like the history, well, because, you know, Timothy Moore, but also the other members of Sibling Architecture, they're academics and they're actually very involved in kind of like research on these topics, and so am I. We just had like these amazing conversations, and we kind of boiled down what we wanted to do in that space to thinking about boudoirs, salons, and nightclubs, and actually the interrelationship also there between voyeurism, you know, the idea of looking, you know, the introspective person. And then the performer, right? The person who wants, the exhibitionist who wants to be seen, and how that relates also to group identities and performing your identity in space, right? Because not everyone can, not everyone feels safe performing their identity, even in a safe space. And actually that a balance between interiority that is protective from which you can look out, combined with a space that allows for people who are much more performative, is actually a really nice balance to try to achieve if you're thinking about the kind of groups of people that we were thinking about. Of course, in the end, we ended up making a very, very colorful confection because that's what I like doing. But the way that we've designed it, it has these things, has these ideas embedded in it.
Yeah. But do you see, when you look at
with a catwalk?
When you look at interior design in general, do you see that some of that these reflections that you are describing are getting more and more importance among interior designers? So is there a tendency that this is heard not only in among a special group of people that have all the rights to propagate it, but also entering, let's say, the more mainstream interior design? Or what would be needed to create this understanding?
Which aspects?
Well, the aspects that space have an influence on performing gender identities, for example, and that this needs to be considered when you design a space. I think it's something that is still rarely taught in interior design classes. So,
I mean, I think it's definitely something which is just generally people are generally becoming much more aware of. I mean, again, we were talking about this before. So I'm speaking from a British context, and I know that, for instance, you're in Germany, and a lot of people who are going to be watching this at some point will be from elsewhere. So what I'm saying is from a specifically British context, with a lot of conversations with Americans as well, and Australians. There's a lot of, there is discussion around it, and, you know, because of research that's been done in Yale, there's like a lot of really, really interesting work happening on the kind of performance of gender in toilets, right? Which is obviously an extremely contentious issue in the United States, particularly. And those are really being looked at, right? Because it's such a difficult point of or space of contention that's kind of universal across the whole of North America. But I think it's not something which can be catered for in such a clear and obvious way in other spaces as it is, for instance, in toilets. And I think there's certain programs, there's certain types of spaces where it can be thought of or should be thought of, but others, I think it's just good enough to be aware. I don't think you can design specifically to make, you know, in every cafe in the land, you know, in all F&B environments to make someone feel safe from a different identity. I think, if anything, right, it's more on a structural level where it should be, I think it should be, or I'm interested in seeing spaces and places being owned by a greater variety of people of different identities. For instance, in the UK, we have this, you know, easy dining kind of boom where all of our high streets are taken over by chains, right? It's very difficult these days to find an independent shop. And this kind of small scale ownership, where spaces can actually be genuinely created by the people themselves with interior designers if necessary, but for them and also for the people that they serve, that is what's going to, I think, create more spaces which make many more people feel welcome in, and also people who are not from that group to come and experience, right? Different
Yeah.
types of identity. And actually, in relation to COVID, which is a complete catastrophe for the high street here, high street, I just mean the shopping areas in the center of each of our towns. However, potentially, right, rents were very high. Potentially, there is the opportunity for a kind of groundswell of much smaller businesses, both retail, restaurants, community spaces, all kinds of things to happen in this kind of what is effectively a great emptying out of our high streets now.
Well, we're leaving the sphere of the interior and moving to the public space, which is also part of your work, and I think it also shows the political aspect that is embedded in your work when you propose a democratic monument, or you suggested a liberal archive next to the British Library. So this shows that you're also aiming to work on the scale of a civic society. So it's not only a question of changing interior spaces, but changing people's perception of communities, of public space. What is your work on that sphere? Is it the idea of changing the way how people interact, or how they practice their democracy and their civic societies?
Sorry. Got a thumping headache, of course, just in time for the talk. So the civic it's related to what we're talking about. So if we think about the kind of the three stages that I talked about, so that, you know, the body and the mirror with the cupboard where you get to change yourself, the interior of the room, the individual room where you get to express yourself, and then the shared space of, let's say, the salon where you get to, or the boudoir, where you get to create a small community which is also expressed externally. Then the outside world through much history, right? To be honest, for most groups that were not mainstream, it was not a space that was it was not an environment that was safe for you to be who you are in a very expressive manner, right? So there was this idea of fitting in and obscuring your difference, which or passing, which was this, you know, whether you were a Huguenot in the 18th century or a Jew in the early 19th century, it was something that everyone had to do, and that's why interiority was very important to them. So there's been a sort of fantastic efflorescence and flowering of kind of liberal multiculturalism. That word has kind of a lot of difficult connotations to it, but I guess what I mean is the sharing of our countries with people of lots of different backgrounds and cultures, who nonetheless manage to get on with shared beliefs, right? Which kind of unify them. So I think of liberalism as a kind of a diversity which is very much under an umbrella of shared values, which are constantly being argued about, right? Which are constantly very contentious and difficult, but then nonetheless shared, right? And everyone agrees to work by those rules. And I think in a liberal society that has reached our stage, I think expression is highly important. So you have lots of, well, you have different minority groups, you have different religious groups, people of different backgrounds and different class backgrounds being represented in professions, right? And people understand that it is very important because the perspectives are quite different, and it's very healthy to have them all present in the public sphere. Not only acting exactly as if they were the same as the person who would have held that position 20 years ago, but actually genuinely bringing their own perspective and a different way of doing things. Again, with respect to how the country operates and the shared system of values. And I think on the symbolic level, it is just as important. So we were talking about how we as people, as humans, we naturally express ourselves through our spaces, on our bodies. And we do that with our cities. Our cities are calcified, reified, solidified versions of our values, right? Which are, I mean, solidified, but they're kind of slowly and constantly changing. And I think what we have now in Britain, again, I think you can maybe extrapolate some of this to other countries, probably especially in Western Europe, but I'm not sure about elsewhere. But you have a fixed form of what is allowed to exist in public space. And that tends to be, well, in the city, right? Buildings tend to either be given approval based upon how they fit into the existing context, which is basically saying everything that exists has to be the same as everything else, which is just like saying to an immigrant 50 years ago, you have to basically behave and dress exactly like everyone else who's here. But it's the architectural equivalent of that. And similarly, like either that, or you have to operate and design in what is considered high quality by the academic mainstream of a given moment, because they sort of stamping what is considered good. And it's kind of a balance between that. It's like fitting in or like academic excellence, what is called innovation or quality. And what this does is it, because you have to go through university, then after university, which is very difficult, then after university, you have to go through training in an architecture school. And it's specifically about architecture, we're talking about public space, but this affects the world of planning and the way that we see what is allowed in public space. And then after that, you have to try and get commissions, and then get the commissions allowed by the planning system. So there are a completely insurmountable set of barriers over like a 20-year period for somebody who wants to bring their difference, right? Not everyone will want to, but those who do, and there'll be a significant minority of people who are from different backgrounds, who have different identities, who want to bring that to the design world. They cannot. There's too many barriers in the way. And what that means is that we have a paucity, right? We have a lack of symbolic diversity in our public realm. So we are not representing ourselves as a country, as a diverse liberal country in any way in our cities, right? The Greeks would be horrified at this idea because, the classical Greeks very much thought that you construct the city very much to absolutely represent the things that you value at that given point in time. And we're not doing that. And there's very extreme versions like central Paris and central Rome, where it's literally frozen. And so and it's allowed, but it's allowed in temporary events. So it's kind of like if we allow Pride to happen once a year, if we allow the Notting Hill Carnival to happen once a year, right? Lots of crazy people dressed in funny colors, join in, big corporations can do a float. That's where it's allowed. It's in a safely contained temporary bottle that does not affect, nobody has to look at it every day of their lives. God forbid, oh my God. And it would be really, I think it would be really helpful if there was, I'm not talking to go to the other extreme, but if we could start to modify our cities by opening them up to more diverse forms of symbolic architectural and representation also in space, right? Also in our public spaces with things which are permanent. And I guess I would think of it as the equivalent of parliament, right? We have a democracy where we have different parties and they all represent different ideas. I wish we had more parties and we had proportional representation, but we don't. But imagine that public space was like a parliament of amicably arguing difference.
It's a wonderful, it's a wonderful metaphor, I think, which is, I totally agree. It's never the case in our cities, but I think one way to get there or to start the way is education, is architectural education. And I'm wondering, you were mentioning your own.
I've left that though.
Well, how was that for you? I mean, it must have been a nightmare. Or did you have support, or did you have teachers where you discovered this attitude of bringing diversity also into architecture and urbanism? How did that work for you during your education as an architect?
During my education, it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
It was not very fun because I was really stubborn. I'm a stubborn poo who refuses to not do the kind of work that I wanted to do. So I was a little bit like a very colourful peacock walking through lots of Patrick Schumachers wearing black. What do you call it? Turtlenecks, looking very depressed at the AA for many years. But no, in terms of my experience of teaching, which is, I guess, very, very, very different to my experience of studying, where I had some amazing teachers, but the environment was very often extremely caustic and extremely aggressive. But teaching, students are amazing. I mean, honestly, I think most of the students I have are so much better than me. And I guess what I loved and I had a certain degree of success in was understanding or being able to draw out, because understanding what you like and what you actually think represents you, expresses you, it's hard work and it takes time and it takes experimentation, and it takes failure, and it takes slowly believing that what you're doing is not rubbish because it doesn't look like what's popular on Pinterest at the moment, or what every single tutor is referencing because it's someone discovered it on a Tumblr archive 2 days ago. It takes a lot of time to get the confidence to kind of follow that. So first of all, there's a lot of work. And secondly, it's very hard in terms of the marking criteria. So the system that's set up for architectural education in the UK, it's, you know, on the one hand, it looks like it fosters a lot of diversity, but actually, on the other hand, there's a lot of box ticking. But separate to the box ticking, there's actually a lot of subjective judgment, which goes into where those boxes are ticked, like good or bad on the box, on the row of boxes. And that subjective judgment tends to be kind of uncritically guided by predispositions of the tutors, or prejudice. Prejudices is too negative a word, but it's predispositions towards exquisite line drawings with too many lines, beautifully presented paper models, things that are cast that look like little jewels, which have somehow just stayed from previous eras as being really good, but actually nobody knows why they're really good anymore. And when somebody produces something that's radically different, not only in form of what's being presented, but also the way that it's presented, it tends to get marked down. And that's problematic. And even the graphical style, right, just is so important, like the type of paper and the graphical style. And a student who's really interested in doing something that's wildly different, but also the graphical style of how he or she presents it, or he, she, or they presents it, is also very, very different. It's a problem. It's a real problem. So it was, it was a balance. I hope I didn't mess my students up.
Well, maybe it's good to mess them up. And,
they're really lovely.
But I think, what you're describing, these conflicts are linked to certain elements of visual language that can either be appearing in the streamlined way or represent diversity. And I think two elements that in your work are so outstanding is color and patterns, or ornament. And I think maybe let's start with the ornament and patterns. I think it's really striking the way how you have revitalized or rediscovered applying ornaments in a way that they look fresh and they bring in an energy on surfaces that hasn't been there before. And we know that the ornament in the classical modernist design dogma has been completely banned. So then there have been movements like, I don't know, Memphis, for example, who have brought the ornament back on the agenda, but it's still rare that the ornament plays an important role. How was it for you? I mean, was there a moment where you said, wow, hey, we need to revisit ornaments. We need this layer of communication on objects, on surfaces. Were there inspirations, or was it always there for you that you were interested in that layer?
No, I mean, it was always there for me. I mean, the things that I, even from my family home and my family, the things that had meaning and were wonderful and substantive were always decorated, right? in very luscious ways. And then, going out into the queer scene in London in the late 90s, identity was embodied in decoration, in graphics, in posters, in colors, aesthetics were very much an expression of identity. The surface, the visual culture, right? Things that didn't do anything, they weren't narrative, but they very much embodied things which were very substantive. And then I went to architecture school, and I was like, immediately, literally on the first day, right? I remember on the first day, I have a sort of wonderful friend, gay friend, who presented a project that he did, I think in high school. And it was this kind of exquisite, like super camp project with like pink and yellow, what do you call it? Arches, not arches, like triumphal arches. And the tutor literally took it as an opportunity to kind of like humiliate them by going, this is not what you do, and deconstructing like exactly why this was superficial, rubbish, bad. It's not about anything that you should be thinking about when you're studying architecture. And it was like a form of negative education on the very, very first day that we were there. And, you know, so of course for me, that was like, well, that's like, that's a challenge.
You have to do something. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in a way, my journey through university was like a journey of learning, or having to learn how to intellectually justify all of the interests that I had naturally had and learnt about through my experience as a child and as a teenager, but justifying it in a kind of academic and architectural, and there's also, you know, it's the AA, so it's design and fine art context as well. And so that, if anything, that passion became kind of jet fueled, right? Because I started to find a lot of writers who had similar opinions to me. I started to also learn about alternative histories of all these people who had been excluded from the canon and weren't taught in our history and theory courses. And, you know, I started to include them in my work, and I started to, you know, my work was not always, it's not only decorative, so decorative is extremely important to me. And that's the work that I like to do, for instance, mostly for the public, and, you know, that most of the things that people see and the products I do. But like, I was making films and I was writing essays, and I still did that. And I'm sort of a bit of an activist. You know, I like to, you know, I publish. And these films were very much also talking about all of these ideas and kind of weaving new narratives through history that would give me the ammunition as a student to say, no, what you're saying is wrong. All of this stuff is serious. It's substantive. It's intellectually fascinating. It's political. And, you know, that served me very well in the long run. And while I was sort of learning the ammunition, I was also doing it. So I was also learning how to actually make it, because another thing is, you know, you have certain periods in recent contemporary architecture have said, oh, ornament's great. But what they do is they do copy paste. There isn't really an understanding of the craft of designing good decoration or ornamental spaces, which are central evocative. And that's on purpose, right? Because it's a kind of masculine, ironic, critical way of distancing yourself, saying, actually, this is just an intellectual exercise that I'm playing with my with this ornament on my really serious masculine programmatic box. And what I tried to do, I guess, through university was learn actually the craft of designing those patterns, right? And understanding how they worked, which is what happened at the Bauhaus. I mean, there's a whole kind of fantastic history of decoration, decorative elements, color theory that was actually probably a lot more important than what a lot of people now think of as the Bauhaus. You know, the black and white photos of actually international style architecture that came afterwards, or the skeleton of the Bauhaus by Gropius, which is the least interesting thing about the Bauhaus.
Oh, what you mentioned. Yeah,
sorry?
It's a construction. You know, it was the image of the Bauhaus was created by Gropius basically to attract students, and you needed a streamlined vision of the Bauhaus. But yes, Bauhaus was very diverse, and there was a very colorful and ornamental tendency there. I
mean, I wouldn't necessarily, you know, stamp it with ornamental at all. I would say profoundly poetical and uncategorizable. I think a lot of the stuff that was being done there was amazingly sophisticated in the area. You know, so like I've got Kandinsky's book on the relationships between like colors and sounds, and you know that's something that was, you know, definitely not taught to us, and that was very inspirational for me when I was going through university. So I was kind of learning the craft of all of these things, and also very much relating it to contemporary media, right? That me as a sort of a gay 21st century person, you know, navigating architecture and design, dealing with alternative history, but also dealing with contemporary technologies and, you know, fabrication technologies, social media, anxieties of my life, and sort of trying to mix them all together. And I guess that's how I learned, or that's how I came about to sort of embed all of these things that are going on that I do into what might on the surface look like it's just a colorful fun thing, but actually it's imbued with a lot of stuff that's always going on behind the surface. But I like to make these silent, eloquent, decorative spaces and objects that have stories behind them, but you don't necessarily need to know the stories. And I guess that's the difference between, for instance, okay, you have this history of, there's like two different histories. There's of ornament and decoration. You've got the history of the kind of if I say the religio-fanatic history, which is the narrative history. It's the kind of top-down, technocratic. I don't know, the top-down controlling version of decoration, which is about the storied surface. It's narrative. It's a surface that tells you things explicitly. It tells you not to do this. It tells you this is good. It tells you Jesus is good in this position. It tells you that person is bad and they're being killed in hell. And or for instance, in the French 19th century, there was an official academy of decoration, and there was a kind of official process of what was allowed to represent the French state and the values of the French state. And it was amazing, but it was very much didactic. It was controlling. And so kind of the narrative surface that has depth, that tells you things, is very much what I don't like, right? That's kind of what pushes people like me away. It controls the way you interpret it. What I love, which is the vast majority of decorative history, is things that don't specifically tell you things. It's the surface that has no depth, right? Or rather, the depth is through the emotive response that it elicits. It's an atmosphere. It's a non-linguistic, a non-didactic way of expressing or sharing feelings, and that's a history that I love. And that's a history, I mean, it's still continuing now. I mean, that's what logos do. I guess that's what flags do. That's what the aesthetics of protest movements do. And obviously there's a more explicit relationship between text and then the ornamental background. But very often, if you go back to kind of pre-contact societies in places outside of Europe that were separate to sort of modern technology, they were very much representing themselves and expressing themselves in not explicit symbolic ways. And if I can give you one quick example, there's in Guyana, I think it might be Suriname, but sort of in that region, there was a group of people who had a traditional local craft that was very ornamental. And they were asked by a visitor, right, who wanted to write a book about them, I think an ethnographer, what do they mean? Right, because everything has to mean something, right? It's like when you go to a National Trust property, everyone goes up to the lady waiting in the room and goes like, "What does that mean?" And there's always an example because people want to have content, right? Otherwise, it's not serious. And the people were like, "It doesn't mean anything." We do it. I mean, it's meaningful to them, but it didn't mean anything explicit. And maybe certain people had certain ones, but it wasn't codified, and it definitely wasn't narrative. So what he did is he actually made up the meanings. He went back to, I think it was Holland. He wrote a book that had made up meanings. And what happened was that increased the sale, because these people were selling them to tourists. It increased the sale of these things like to an astronomical degree, because all of the European tourists were like, "Oh, this one means that, and this one means that, and it's so fascinating, and let's take it home to Jonathan, and he'll put it on his shelf, and he'll tell everyone what it means." And it's that desire to be told didactically things that is a kind of, it's a little bit like a desire for dominion or to be dominated. So, it's going in the wrong direction there. Talking about the dominated.
It's super interesting. It reminds me, it goes a little bit in another direction, but before I started to work in a design museum, I spent some time in Marrakesh, in Morocco, working in a museum that exhibited Arab art, but also Berber art. And you know that in Islamic cultures, the ornament, there is only the ornament, but the ornament is flat. It's because it's a non-iconographic ornament. Yeah. And then there were these rugs by Berber women, which have a different type of ornament, which is more linked to the African cultures, more geometric. And all the visitors were always asking, well, what do these patterns on the carpets mean? This looks like a frog, and the frog is about pregnancy. And I used to tell them that it might come from, it might be derived from the form of a frog 5,000 years ago. But the women don't say, "I'm weaving a frog." It's an unconscious language, and it is meaningful, as you say, but it's not an alphabet that you use to write a text. It's something where it's like you know how to build a building very well, and you know how to put one stone on the other, and by building a great wall, you express a wonderful craft and you express a wonderful language. So that to me is an expression of ornament that is super relevant, and that is I totally agree that this is much more interesting, that this codified ornament of the European 18th and 19th century, that was really an alphabet that you learned by copying. You were really trained to copy ornaments and to apply them and to express something. And
which I think very much, has its origins in the Catholic Church in the medieval period, with the kind of evolution of a pan-European Gothic approach, both to art and architecture.
Another thing that interests me is thinking about ornament in design. We're just working on an exhibition about Memphis, the Italian design group.
Who?
Memphis.
I'm joking.
I don't want to compare your own work to it, but I'm interested.
It's fine, everyone does.
I'm interested in hearing your opinion about it, because to me, looking at Memphis works, which we have in our collection, really also opened my eyes for ornament in design, because they were also proclaiming that they were realizing flat ornaments. It was not about creating some kind of message, but creating a surface, but saying the surface is interesting. It's not the surface is irrelevant and the structure is relevant, but it's the surface that gives you the message.
In terms of, look, as I mentioned to you when we had our pre-chat, it's, people see anything with any sort of color in it or bright color, and they're like, oh my God, it's Memphis. And so I honestly, it's just, I get frustrated with that, but I know a lot about Memphis. I'm deeply respectful of them, and actually in spirit, there's a huge amount of similarities in what we were just discussing, because what you're saying about the idea of surface, which doesn't necessarily communicate but has an emotive effect, I'm the same. So I guess what you could probably call them a phenomenological approach to decoration, right? In the sense that they look, and I'm the same. I guess I would probably, if anything, think of myself in terms of the end product that I create as a phenomenologist. I actually want to create and what I guess what I mean for that, for people who don't know the sort of stuff around it, and I don't even know that much, but it means it's kind of how things affect you on a bodily level, on an instinctive level, on the level of the imagination that's not intellectual, right? Things just affect you directly, without language, without narrative. And they talk about that a lot. They don't talk about that specifically, but they talk about how, I'm referring specifically here to Barbara Radice and the way that she has phrased, in retrospect, the things that they've done, right? So this is not actually the words of the practitioners necessarily, but from Barbara, that they wanted to create things which were exciting or shocking or slivery or strange, or it's creating emotive psychological effects in people through the concatenation of colors and patterns and forms, and that's that idea of effect, that through the way they feel, through the way that they look, is 100% the kind of thing that I like to do in the end result. I guess the difference is also with me, there's a quite specific political identity based and also formal research that relates to me, I guess, and my interests and my background that feed into those. Whereas with Memphis, first of all, it was a diverse group, but I guess in the core group didn't necessarily have that, because they were all from a relatively similar context, I guess, and there was very much a kind of a reaction to that Italian, Western European, both academic but also design context, and also the radical design that had just come before them. So I guess obviously my context is different, I guess, and my process is different.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's it was a time where, after this very politicized 1960s and 70s, Memphis was also in favor of depoliticizing design. So it was about also a hedonistic approach.
Yeah, I mean, what's that thing Sotsas always said, right? He said, I don't want to do public buildings, I only want to do private spaces.
But he also played it down, he was great in, just saying, in understating, but of course it was also about liberation, but by also.
But on a private, it was always liberation on a private level.
Yeah, a little bit like pop art, a little bit like Andy Warhol in pop art, celebrating consumerism and advertising, etc. But at the end, of course, it was also critical by
Of course, no, absolutely, yeah. And I guess, I do see. I think there's similarities in the way that maybe one can think of Rem Koolhaas and Ettore Sottsass in the way that they relate to almost immovable and unstoppable forces of consumerism and kind of contemporary economics, which were different obviously in the 70s, and they were different in the 90s when Rem was working. And they don't reject them fully. They work with them and they kind of find the poetry within them, but they're also at the same time critical of them. And I think that's why I worked at Rem's office. I was very much drawn to Rem's approach and Sottsass's approach in the philosophical relationship to contemporary economics, politics, and society. Because otherwise, I guess what I liked with them also, there's the situation like, do you end up just screaming angry words from an academic position that you've gotten a tenure in for the rest of your life, or do you completely give up and just totally just believe in the kind of corporate work that you're doing? And I think both of them found quite a beautiful in between place to be, which is not a very fashionable thing to be at the moment. But I guess in terms of, for me, like I've always had I would like to be like that, but at the same time I'm also a very difficult and quite a political and quite a loud-mouthed person who can't keep his opinions in. I guess I'm probably a little bit of a mix of like radical design with Memphis, like in spirit, like nowhere near as good as either or any of those practitioners, but just in terms of spirit, a bit of both.
But I think you also found a beautiful place to as a base for your own work. I think this, mixing working in different scales, working on this edge of artistic practice, activism, design, architecture is really needed at the moment. So I have a great admiration for that. And I think, I'm really looking forward to seeing much more from you in the coming years. And hopefully
find me some projects.
Yes, I will work on that.
It's been a difficult period with COVID. 2020 was going to be a really, really great year, and it just everything just.
Yeah.
So hang on, Mumu's wanting to say hello again.
Hey. Okay, Adam. That was a wonderful talk. It was super interesting and inspiring.